Hey everybody, Phil Spy here, and today I've got a special guest, Andy Atkinson, author of the book High Performance PostgreSQL for Rails. I met Andy at RailsConf 2024 where he gave a really interesting talk, and that was last month. Oh, I shouldn't have talked about the dates. Anyway, the book's out right now, and Andy's here to share his invaluable insights on how to optimize PostgreSQL for your Rails application. He's leveraging years of experience in this field. And whether you're a seasoned developer or just getting started, this conversation absolutely promises to elevate your understanding of PostgreSQL. Let's dive right in. Nice meeting you again. And I have a very important question that I really wanted to start off with. PostgreSQL or PostgreSQL? PostgreSQL or PostgreSQL? What's your preferred pronunciation?
I just forget about the QL because it's difficult to say, I think, as a word, like it's a word with letters on the end, which is not, I don't know if there's any other words in English that are like that.
Right.
So I just say Postgres.
Yeah, used to say PostgreSQL, but then I thought, well, the SQL means something.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's actually a confusing product term the more you think about it.
The history of that's really interesting too, because there were times where it was called Postgres and then PostgreSQL. And I think the official word is PostgreSQL now. But interestingly, that wasn't always the case. So depending on which evidence you pull, you can kind of make the argument that it should be one way or the other. But certainly, I think everyone agrees pronouncing it is easier without the QL. Mm-hmm. And then typically, I think you've probably noticed too, like a lot of tech companies that are building on Postgres almost, I feel like, has a little bit more of a approachable vibe, maybe just without the QL. And so I feel like a lot of product companies and stuff will just use Postgres.
I think also because there's this subtle thing, to jump almost to the end of your book, there's this subtle thing where it's really an ecosystem, right? It's not just, it is everything built on top really of a database, but they're kind of getting into this space where you have queues and key value store and all the rest of that stuff. It's more than an SQL relational database.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I kind of was really debating whether or not I chose PostgreSQL for the book title because it's the official word. But I do actually like this point that you're making that there's so much more to it than SQL, lots of different commands and transactional and non-transactional concepts. And, SQL is, that being said, Postgres implements, has a SQL standards based development kind of constraint. New editions are based on SQL standards, but it's almost like you get pretty far away from kind of what most people might think of as, vanilla SQL with your basic set of a couple of tables and join operations and wheres and selects, but there's so much more you can do.
So for me, my background is when I first started to work in a situation where there was a non-embedded database, because in the 90s, kind of, we always had embedded databases, and I was doing applications. And when I moved to something that was more web-based, which still was, let's say, 2000, my first big job, our database was Oracle. Mm-hmm. So, Oracle, again, is another thing that's kind of like, it's an ecosystem. It's not just, an SQL database. Right. So Oracle, I can kind of see a relationship between Oracle and Postgres in a way. And when I left that Oracle shop, I was so shell-shocked from database usage that I went to MySQL, because MySQL seemed to be so much easier. Mm-hmm. And it was just a SQL database. And I think I used MySQL or MySQL for a long period of time. And I regret now not moving over to Postgres earlier. And also I regret now that my main product is built on top of my SQL, not on top of Postgres, because I see a lot more power inside of Postgres, and I think a lot more flexibility. And in your book, there's so many points there. It's like every chapter was like, oh, if only I could do that now. So, it's actually, I think your book and the talk that you did at RailsConf and the book really is kind of motivating me to once again revisit moving from MySQL over to Postgres, which is a non-trivial thing to do, of course. But as the book is about Postgres and Rails, one of the questions I had was, Rails developers, like myself, we focus a lot on ActiveRecord, and we want to do everything with ActiveRecord. But in your book, there's lots of SQL directly.
Yep.
What do you think about that balance? I mean, should we as Rails developers be looking more at writing custom SQL, or how does that break?
Yeah, well, I think that by interacting most closely via SQL with your data, and your tables and your indexes and constraints and your database objects, there's the lowest friction between, I guess, trying to express what you need in terms of queries or inserting data, that sort of thing. But of course, it's completely detached from an application. But I think it helps build the mental model for, the lowest kind of the lowest surface area between kind of from the client application and into the Postgres database. And then with that mental model, then you can basically try to do the similar thing with ActiveRecord. Mm-hmm. So if you have a SQL statement with a where clause and a bunch of filters, then, I think about how to do that with named scopes and in your different ActiveRecord models that map to your database tables. And so I personally don't mind writing, I'm not someone who pushes folks to write more SQL and replace ActiveRecord code. But I think if you only write ActiveRecord code and don't tend to write a lot of SQL and interact a lot directly with the database, I think you're missing out on some opportunities to explore different features, different approaches that are going to be beyond what ActiveRecord might, what you might commonly do with ActiveRecord. And then if you do explore new approaches like more advanced query types, CTEs and subqueries and unions and different things like that, then you can go and you can make a determination. Can we do this in ActiveRecord? How do we adapt this SQL back to ActiveRecord? Or maybe it does make the most sense to just use ActiveRecord as your kind of client wrapper to facilitate sending a query to Postgres, but just write SQL within ActiveRecord, which you can do too. And then you can kind of mix and match.
Do you think that there's a gap there between what ActiveRecord can do? Like, do you think that there's cases where you really can't do it with ActiveRecord, or it's not? Sometimes it's hard to tune the query, if you know what I mean, by trying to stay with ActiveRecord as much as possible, Yeah. And I'm just wondering if there should be more stuff. I don't know how, this is kind of just off the top of my head, but could there be more extensions to ActiveRecord to kind of support some of these more sophisticated queries?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly has been over the years, and some are mentioned in the book. Like, for example, the ActiveRecord CTE Ruby gem was, a third-party Ruby gem that helped facilitate writing common table expression SQL queries, but still getting ActiveRecord relations and being able to glue objects together and use ActiveRecord things. And then Ruby on Rails, for that, using that example, Ruby on Rails decided to incorporate common table expressions into Rails, into ActiveRecord. So now we can do that. And we don't really need the gem to be able to do common table expressions. So I think with that example, I think there's things like database views. There's more database functionality essentially. And, I think one of the challenges with having direct support in that for ActiveRecord is ActiveRecord, of course, as you know, supports multiple database engines. So if there's functionality that is specific to Postgres, it's going to be harder to get that into ActiveRecord. Interestingly, there are some examples where there is Postgres exclusive features in ActiveRecord, and it's sort of feature flagged. Like if this feature is supported, then you can use certain behavior.
Right.
And there's an ActiveRecord in Postgres page I was tweeting about recently that showed some examples. For example, I think exclusion constraints.
Mhm.
I think you can. I'd have to double check that actually, but some features like that, or table partitioning is something we cover in the book.
Mhm.
There's a Postgres implementation of table partitioning, but splitting up a table into partitions is not unique to Postgres. It's a concept in other relational
Right.
databases. So something like that could be interesting in the future to pull into ActiveRecord.
Hmm. Yeah, I was just, because I was thinking about, yes, I mean, it is this thing. I guess I understand the Rails stance that, okay, we have to kind of be database agnostic,
Mm-hmm.
but and also at some point you don't want to remove the ability to do something that, is so available. Yeah, it's an interesting line to walk, I think. And I guess that's really, we have gems for that. And it's kind of, maybe there should be, as you pointed out in the book, a lot of gems that are kind of like give the access to these Postgres features. I think that that's probably the best way to go, and it doesn't have to be inside of Rails proper.
Yeah, and as what's interesting, there's a lot of things in common with Ruby on Rails and Postgres. They're both large open source projects that are mature and have been around for decades now, with hundreds or even thousands of contributors, depending on what kind of timeline you're looking at and that sort of thing. And I think it's fair to say they both share the mindset that for new functionality, it's not a bad idea for it to be an extension. They're both extensible systems, whether it's a Ruby gem or a Rails plugin, or on the Postgres side, a Postgres extension.
Hmm.
Those that can be a great way to do open source because you can sort of validate it. You can get some adoption and make the case for then promoting that into being a core feature. But it does mean that on the flip side of that, I think for people that are using Rails or Postgres and aren't using a lot of extensions, they need to know that those exist and where to find them and
Yeah.
determine their quality. There's of course like a big range on quality. And so I think like anytime functionality is native or in the core, it's great because then it's first class functionality. It's documented well, it's tested well. A lot of people use it. So yeah, those are, they're different trade-offs.
Hmm. So how are you approaching this? Like, what is your background? Are you coming at it from, let's say, more of the database side of things, or would you consider yourself a Rails developer? Like, what's your background? Because I don't really know, and it's not really in the book or anything.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I guess I didn't, uh, I do tell people like I still identify more as a developer. Most of my career has been as an application developer and a software engineer. So that was a big part of why I decided to write the book, is I didn't think there were a lot of database books for application developers. And as I'd say my database specialization is only about 3 or 4 years old at this point, where I consider myself now a developer, but a database specialist. And the way that's played out at companies is, I tend to be on like an infrastructure team, likely, and working more with Postgres, possibly even more than doing application development. Kind of depends on the needs of the company, I guess. As a consultant now, I would say I'm not really doing application development. I am doing more Postgres work for application development teams. Okay. But what I can do is then bring that more specialized database focused set of information to, sort of complement the application or product teams. But yeah, I think like, my, as opposed to what I like about that being sort of there's this term application DBA that I always like to cite this engineer Haki Benita, who introduced me to that concept. It's basically, using the database thinking about all of the ways that you use the database from the application's perspective, and then, making that work as well as possible, the best performance and the most efficient use and that sort of thing. So it sort of like draws a box around the kinds of things you do with the database, as opposed to being a database administrator that might approach it from the other side and from maybe a server instance, and focus on backups and focus on users and administration, security, networking, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's because I think I notice our recording is all a bit screwy, at least on my side, but that'll be fine. Because I think that background really informs how you work with a database, and I think your experience is actually kind of unique. Not unique. It's unusual, because I think a lot of people, when they're on the application side, they stick on the application side.
Yeah.
And they don't dive so much into the database, for good or for bad. And I'm guilty of that, I think, as well, because also I came from that background where we had, I came from a time where we had DBAs and everything like that. And
right.
I don't think that that's so common now.
Yeah, I think there's been there always seems to be an expansion of, well, actually, let me take a step back. Yeah, it's really interesting to think about why there's fewer DBAs today than there were in the past, which I think is true. There's people that study this. And I may have cited something like that. I did actually write about database skills and jobs in the market in a section that I ended up cutting for the book, because I didn't think it sort of met a good enough quality standard with evidence, and that kind of thing. But I do think, just to go back a bit to what you said before, I don't think it's a very common path. And so one way I looked at that was, it's not a crowded market of people trying to do this, particularly in Rails and with Postgres in particular. Mm-hmm. So that might allow me to make more of a splash, whether it's writing the book or now we're trying to, find new clients and work as a consultant and that sort of thing. But there's also a reason, because I do think that within the Ruby on Rails world, a lot of the jobs are more focused on being application developers and product developers and that sort of thing. And, that's great. That makes sense. And so I think there's, it's a little bit of a different kind of job market. I think if you do prefer to work a lot with the database, then, you do tend to work more on an infrastructure team and focus on data management and automation around database tasks and things like that. And so and then there's, depending on the size of the company, you might be solely doing that at a large company, or you might be doing a blend at a mid-sized company of application development and database work or scaling work. And then as far as like scalability and stuff, which is of course a big emphasis of the book, high performance queries and optimized indexes and that kind of thing. That sort of stuff is going to be, it's fun to learn. It's not necessarily going to be needed until you reach a certain scale.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that I think is very interesting about the book is that a lot of developers don't work on applications that ever experience problems because the applications never get big enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I think it was interesting in the book that, there are, I don't know necessarily that I've seen another book that talks about so many issues that we get to when we're at scale, and that's one of the things I really liked about it, because I saw that. I went, okay, I'm experiencing this issue that you're talking about, and it's interesting, this solution, which I can't do because I'm on my SQL, But it's interesting, this solution. And I think that anybody who is working at scale, this book is going to be pretty welcome, because like I say, I don't think I've seen another book like it. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been privileged to have a few job opportunities where, I worked on higher scale applications, and that was a big part of what went into choosing to write the book. In particular, when I worked for a company within Microsoft a few years back, the application was already experiencing a huge surge of usage when I had joined, and it was a global sort of application in the education space. And we had scaled up. Even when I had joined, they had already scaled up towards the top of the biggest instances available on AWS for running Postgres. It was Postgres 10 at the time. And so there was this great opportunity to say, okay, well, we're almost going to be in a really bad situation here. We can't scale vertically any further. So what are we going to do? And there was a lot of in-place optimization work we could do to buy us more time, buy us more headroom, and that sort of thing. And that really was the kind of origin of my deep dive into buying Postgres books myself, reading as much as I could, working with people in the company that were Postgres experts. And that was a really cool experience that helped shape me having the opportunity to speak about Postgres. And then that turned into the opportunity to write the book. And yeah, there's a lot to learn that is going to be specific to when you reach a certain scale. It's going to matter a lot more, like that your indexes are well tuned and supporting your queries. You're minimizing all of your access and really focusing heavily on latency with your client Rails application accessing your database. It's going to matter a lot when, you have big row counts, high query volume, and you want to still have a good user experience. You're kind of forced into that. So yeah, I hope that some people are able to pick up this book and maybe they're starting at a bigger company that operates at a bigger scale. Maybe they aspire to pick up some of these skills and make that leap in the future. Maybe they're at a company that is smaller now, but they hope, is successful and can attract a lot of users and usage.
Yeah, yeah, like I say, I think it's interesting and unusual and great. I'm grateful for it from my position, because I suffer from one of the things that you talk about in the book, which is quite clear, which is over-indexing. And I think that this is a common problem for naive developers, certainly naive database developers like myself, where it was kind of like, oh, we need an index for that. Oh, we need an index for that. And then I end up absolutely with a database that's over-indexed. Yeah, so now I've got to figure out how to step that back.
Yeah, and that's, typically it's if you're at a I think that's pretty common. There's both having kind of being over-indexed and having indexes that are unused or that are redundant.
Yep.
And then there's also on the other extreme, there's missing indexes and being under-indexed and having a lot of queries that would benefit from an index where there isn't one. And so in the book, we look at both scenarios in different parts of the book. And yeah, the idea there is for people to basically build the skills to go and look at their own applications and databases and say, are we missing indexes here? Do we have indexes that are not used? When I read a query plan, how do I know my index is used that I just added? How do I adjust it and make sure that it's used? That sort of thing. Yeah, I think just wanted to add, like, I mentioned this before to others too. I actually think that's possibly the highest return on investment for your learning time as an application developer. If you're like, I don't want to get super into the weeds with the database, but I know I want to know better whether my indexes make sense for my queries. Like, I think investing in that area is a great return on investment.
Yeah. And I was going to say that I think that if you're over-indexed, I think you're probably also missing indexes, because I think it's just a flag saying we don't really know what we're doing. You know what I mean? And I think that sounds maybe harsh to say, but I'm saying it about myself, so I think it's okay I say that. But if you've over-indexed, you most likely have missed other indexes that would be more helpful.
Yeah, or another way to say what you're saying is if you're not able to tell that your indexes aren't being used, like if you're adding indexes in a speculative fashion, which I think is pretty common, and then maybe you're not really checking in on it, or you don't have any kind of automation or tools or observability tools that are saying you have unused indexes here, which there's several and there's some that are mentioned in the book, and that sort of thing. Then it's unlikely that you may also then have the kind of corollary problem of not knowing whether you're missing indexes for your queries. And so, I think, that's where I think when I was first learning about how to create indexes, what they even were for, years ago. I mean, I think most people start off with a few basic guidelines, like where this column's in a where clause, so there should be an index for it. And that's not necessarily bad advice, and it might actually be what a lot of queries need to lessen their access cost. But I mean, it's going to be kind of the level one, and then there's many more levels beyond that. But the core activity is the same, which is basically just knowing how your queries are being planned and processed by Postgres, and then adding in indexes to lessen their cost and speed up their execution time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great advice, and I think that, again, I mean, not to heap too much praise on you, but I think that the book walks you through a lot of things that I think as developers we just don't know, because I think app developers, we just don't pay that much attention really to it. Maybe it's just me. I don't know.
No, it's not. It's not just you. It's and I think there, like some other people that have reviewed the book as well have said things like Elizabeth Christensen, who's a friend and is a Postgres person. She was like, she said something along the lines of what she liked about the book is just kind of bringing together these two knowledge communities that often are just separate. It's just kind of like these, and so trying to kind of be in the middle of that. And I really like that idea too, and I appreciated her saying that, because like that is kind of where I'm going with this. Like, I think there's a lot of untapped potential. But even if you're using Postgres in a basic way, but you want to up your insights and your skills with it, I think there's going to be content in the book that is going to help people do that. And sort of the more you know about its operational model and essentially what you're trying to do, like access data cheaply and insert data cheaply, update data, that sort of thing. And you know where to look to get that information. You're going to help yourself scale your own applications a lot, whether it's ActiveRecord code or plain SQL. You're helping smooth things out and make things more efficient at the Postgres layer.
Yeah. And I loved the field guide at the end. Oh, cool. I don't know if that's your idea or whose idea that was, but I think every technical book should have that.
Thank you. It was kind of initially it was based on some tech reviewer feedback. The feedback is anonymized at the stages that I received it at, so I don't actually know who gave it, but someone kind of had finished reading the whole book, or they did the second part at least, and they were like, well, I've kind of read everything, but I sort of realized, like, what if I have a specific problem? How do I jump into a part of the book? Like, I don't want to read the book front to back. So there was that feedback, and I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I should, for the next time I talk about this, I should figure out which book I'm thinking of, but there's another tech book I was reading. It didn't use the word field guide, but it kind of had like a orientation section, and I really liked that. And so there was a couple things that went into it, but field guide, I just thought was like a fun words. It made me think of being like out in the field and having a magnifying glass and a net to catch a butterfly or something like that. But it's like, but I acknowledge, like, people aren't going to read the book front to back. It's written in such a way that you could, but if you want to start by just going to the very back and looking at a specific problem, then we tried to add citations in to the book to where you could go and dive into like, dive to solutions, but read a little bit of lead in context and then see if that kind of maps up to what problems you're facing.
Well, I was thinking about it because when I saw that, at the same time I saw that, I was having a problem with my refrigerator, and refrigerators are now no longer simple devices. So you have this huge manual, and then at the back it says, if this isn't happening, here's the 10 pages that spread throughout this manual that you can go and look at. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, it's ridiculous that you have so many things to look at for this one problem, but at least they were clever enough to do that.
Yeah.
And I thought it's the same kind of thing with this field guide in your book. No, I really liked that. I thought that was a clever idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess it is like a troubleshooting guide, and it probably comes as no surprise to you, but like I'm one of those kind of people that likes to read manuals for at least for stuff I care about that I buy or that's complex.
Right.
Like we just got a new car recently, my spouse and myself, and I was honestly pretty excited to like crack open the physical manual and just, certain nerd things like, setting up CarPlay and customization options and things like that. I was like, I'm going to get into this.
I've just gone through the exact same thing. And so I'm sitting in the car yesterday, actually, sitting in the car doing this thing. And my wife's like, what are you pressing all those buttons for? And I said, well, I want to see the battery charging on the dashboard while I'm doing and she's like, how do you know about all these things? And I said, well, I read the manual.
Yeah.
And so yes. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for just reading the manual, and I tried to call out a lot to the Postgres documentation and the Rails guides and the Rails API documentation, which are all, I think, really great. Like, I think they're all written very clearly and free of, errors. And for the most part, there's at least some examples and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So what I wanted to try to then extend that and have good examples, exercises where possible, and bring in some of the kind of, real world use scenarios that I've seen like at my jobs and that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, a lot of how I've learned Postgres too is just reading the Postgres docs, which are quite in depth and comprehensive. And I'm not saying I understand every little bit, but getting an overview and then saying like, okay, I know I want to do, I've got a JSON B column. What are my options for indexing fields within this JSON B column, and going and poring over those docs and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's nothing wrong with pointing back to that documentation, because I think that we're kind of over documented in a sense in this world. And it's good. We just need a reminder like, oh, you can go back and look at that, and I sometimes forget to go and look at the guides, the Rails guides and so on. I'm busy Googling away for something, and then like the answer is right there in the middle of a basic Rails guide. So it's absolutely nothing wrong with pointing back to those,
Yeah, it happens to the best of us. I think every programmer can identify with that. Like, oh, yeah, shoot, if I had just read this.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for your time. I think that that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about and get a good idea for the book and everything like that. And it's nice chatting with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for saying all the nice things about the book and everything. And I'm glad that you're finding it useful and interesting. And that's really, really great to hear.
Yeah. And I also learned the new term, this database zoo.
Oh, yeah.
And absolutely, I am a zookeeper. Absolutely, I am a zookeeper. So, yeah, that's another thing I've got to address, because I was like, in the first line of that section, I was like, oh my God, that's me. Because yes, I have MySQL, I have Elasticsearch, I have Redis, I have Memcache, and I probably have something else I'm not even thinking about. And in a sense, they are doing all the same thing. They're just storing and retrieving data.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. I'm using SQS, as a queue server.
Oh, yeah.
And all these other things that I know you could just do with Postgres. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's a term, database zoo, database sprawl. Others have coined that term, and there's some links to some other write-ups about those terms and stuff, but
Yeah.
I think they've been coined because it's a pretty common scenario.
Yeah.
But it is worth, every time when, particularly, what I hope people take away mostly is maybe they'll learn some capabilities that they didn't really think of Postgres as being capable of before.
Yeah.
And then they'll maybe, we're starting to see that with Rails too, with solid cache and solid queue coming to be database backed caching and database backed queue management. There were of course other options before, but being native in Rails, it's sort of some validation there as well that, modern databases with modern disk drives are super fast, and there's probably more we could do with them and run fewer things, have a smaller zoo, smaller tent, and that might help us, be more efficient, avoid data inconsistency issues, that sort of thing.
One of the things that, this is kind of a tangent, but one of the things, I just did this video about Turbo 8, and it annoys me.
Well, that was a fascinating, informative session with Andy Atkinson. If you enjoyed this interview and you found any value in this discussion, of course, hit the like, subscribe, and bell notification, but go out and buy his book, High Performance PostgreSQL with Rails. It's definitely going to dive deeper than what we talked about today. Today, we didn't really get into the nuts and bolts of it, and that book is all nuts and bolts. So thanks for watching. Stick around if you want to see more great Rails content, great interviews, business stuff, just the whole thing. Bye for now.